Welcome back to Religious Stories for Sleep, where history becomes your lullaby and the ancient world your pathway to rest. If you're new here, let me tell you what we do. We take you on long, detailed journeys through the past, through the daily rhythms and forgotten routines of people who lived thousands of years ago. We move slowly, we move carefully, and we never rush. Because this isn't about excitement. This is about letting your mind wander through time until it finds its way to sleep. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Greece. But not the Greece of philosophers debating in marble halls or warriors clashing on blood-soaked fields, though we'll certainly encounter some of that grim reality. No, tonight we're interested in something far more mundane, far more repetitive, and therefore far more perfect for sleep. The daily life of temple servants. The people who woke before dawn to prepare sacrifices. The people who scrubbed blood from altar stones. The people who maintained the complex machinery of Greek religion, one endless ritual at a time. Now, before we begin our journey into the past, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy these long, meandering trips through history, if you find yourself drifting off to the sound of ancient routines and forgotten rituals, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment about which historical period you'd like to visit next. And if you're feeling particularly generous before sleep claims you, tap that like button. These simple actions help us create more of these sleep-inducing historical odysseys. Imagine yourself, if you will, transported back 2,500 years. The modern world, with its electric lights and climate control and endless conveniences, has vanished. You're standing in the pre-dawn darkness of ancient Athens or Delphi or Olympia. The air is cool. You can smell wood smoke from distant hearths, the earthy scent of olive groves, the faint mineral tang of limestone dust, and you're about to begin your day as a temple servant. How long would you last? The answer, quite frankly, is probably not very long, and over the next 2 hours, we're going to explore exactly why in excruciating, sleep-inducing detail. We'll follow the rhythms of temple life, from the pre-dawn preparations to the evening offerings. We'll meet the oracle at Delphi, breathing in mysterious vapors and speaking words that would shape the fate of empires. We'll investigate the lingering mysteries of how these oracles actually worked. And finally, we'll peek behind the curtain at the priests, the patrons, and the staggering wealth that flowed through these sacred spaces. But all of that is ahead of us. For now, settle yourself somewhere comfortable. Let the weight of your body sink into whatever supports it. We have hours ahead of us. Hours of ancient Greece, hours of ritual and routine, and the strange, comforting monotony of religious life in a world so distant from our own that it might as well be another planet. Let's begin. Your first mistake would be thinking you could sleep in. In the world of ancient Greek temple service, the day begins in darkness, in that peculiar pre-dawn stillness when the world holds its breath between night and day. The roosters haven't yet begun their chorus. The marketplace vendors haven't started their calls. Even the philosophers, those notorious late sleepers, are still buried in their blankets. But you're awake. Or rather, you'd better be awake, because the senior temple attendant is already making his rounds. And if he finds you still on your sleeping mat, well, that's a problem that will follow you through the rest of your very long day. Let's paint this picture with the kind of detail that will, hopefully, lull you toward sleep. You're lying on a simple mat of woven reeds, covered by a woolen blanket that smells faintly of sheep and smoke. The air in the small dormitory room is cool, hovering just above comfortable, that temperature where you're grateful for the blanket, but not quite cold enough to shiver. Through the single window you can see nothing but darkness. No streetlights, of course. No electric glow on the horizon. Just the pure, absolute darkness that modern humans almost never experience, broken only by the distant pinprick of a few stars. And somewhere in that darkness you hear footsteps, not the soft padding of bare feet, but the deliberate shuffle of sandals on stone. The senior attendant, making his rounds. In a moment, he'll reach your door, and he'll expect to find you already dressed, already moving toward your morning duties. Now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal? It's just waking up early. People do it all the time. But here's where the ancient Greek religious establishment reveals its first layer of absolute, uncompromising rigor. This isn't just about being awake. This is about purity. Ritual purity. The kind of purity that makes modern hand-washing protocols look positively casual. Before you can even think about beginning your duties, you must purify yourself. And ancient Greek purification was an art form of paranoia and precision. Stand with me for a moment at the purification basin. It's located in a small courtyard adjacent to the main temple complex, open to the sky. The stone basin, carved from local marble, is about waist-high, constantly supplied with water from a sacred spring. The water is cold. Not merely cool, but genuinely cold. The kind of cold that makes your breath catch when it first touches your skin. Strip away your sleeping tunic. Stand in the pre-dawn darkness, naked and already regretting your decision to serve the gods. The night air raises goosebumps across your skin. You can hear, somewhere in the distance, the first uncertain bird calls, announcing the approach of dawn. Now, the water. You must immerse your hands first, up to the elbows. The cold is immediate and shocking. You must wash your face, your neck, your arms, your feet, every part of your body that might come into contact with sacred objects must be purified. And you must do this in absolute silence. No complaints, no sharp intakes of breath. Silence is part of the ritual. But here's the truly exhausting part. This is just the beginning. This is the first purification of many. If you touch something impure during the day, and the list of impure things is staggeringly long, you must purify yourself again. Touch a dead mouse in the grain storage? Purify. Accidentally brush against someone who's been to a funeral? Purify. Sneeze during a ritual? Believe it or not, purify. The ancient Greeks had developed an entire taxonomy of pollution, a complex system of miasma that would make modern germaphobes look relaxed by comparison. Death was polluting. Birth was polluting. Sex was polluting. Menstruation was deeply polluting. Even certain foods could render you temporarily unfit for temple service. And it wasn't just physical pollution. Moral pollution was equally concerning. Tell a lie? That's miasma. Break an oath? Miasma. Even witnessing violence could pollute you, making you temporarily unfit to approach the gods. Imagine living in this state of constant vigilance, always monitoring your purity status, always aware that the next thing you touch or see or do might require another trip to that freezing purification basin. By the time you've completed your initial purification and dressed in your clean tunic, because yes, you must wear fresh clothing every day, or at least clothing that's been ritually cleansed, the sky is beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but that gradual transition from black to deep blue to the first hints of gray. The temple complex is stirring now. Other attendants are emerging from their quarters, moving with the practiced efficiency of routine. No one is talking. The early morning hours in a Greek temple were observed in silence, a period of collective meditation before the chaos of the day's rituals began. Your first duty is sweeping. This might sound simple. It's not. The temple precinct must be absolutely immaculate. Every morning, every single morning, the entire area must be swept clean of leaves, dust, bird droppings, any detritus that accumulated overnight. You're given a broom made of bundled twigs, and you begin at the outermost edge of the precinct, working your way inward in a spiral pattern that has been followed for generations. The repetitive motion might actually be soothing under other circumstances. Back and forth, the soft whisper of twigs on stone, the gradual accumulation of dust and debris in front of your broom. But remember, you're doing this in pre-dawn dimness, and the precinct is large, very large. The sanctuary of Olympian Zeus at Athens, for instance, covered several acres. Even a modest temple complex might encompass an area the size of a modern football field. And you can't just sweep hastily and call it done. The priests will inspect. They always inspect. A missed leaf, a cluster of dust in a corner, a smudge of bird dropping on the steps. Any of these can result in punishment. Not severe punishment, usually. The Greeks, for all their religious strictness, weren't generally into corporal punishment for minor infractions. But you might find yourself assigned to even less pleasant duties. And trust me, we'll get to those less pleasant duties shortly. As the sun finally crests the horizon, painting the marble temples in shades of pink and gold, the real work begins, preparing the morning sacrifice. Now, here's where we need to address something directly. Ancient Greek religion involved animal sacrifice. Lots of animal sacrifice. Daily animal sacrifice. And if you're going to serve in a Greek temple, you're going to be intimately involved in the killing, butchering, and burning of animals. Sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, sometimes birds, occasionally more exotic offerings. If you're a vegetarian, you wouldn't last an hour. If you're squeamish about blood, you wouldn't make it to lunch, because this wasn't a clean, sanitized process. This was industrial-scale butchery in the name of the gods. Let me walk you through a typical morning sacrifice, and I'll try to do so in a way that's honest about the realities while still maintaining our calming tone. Because this, too, was part of the rhythm of ancient life, repeated so often that it became almost meditative in its routine. The animal arrives at dawn, led by its owner or by one of the temple's own herdsmen. Let's say it's a sheep. A young ram, perhaps, with a good coat and clear eyes. The animal must be unblemished, perfect according to ritual standards. Any scar, any deformity, any sign of disease makes it unacceptable to the gods. Your job as a junior temple attendant is to inspect the animal. You run your hands through its wool, checking for scabs or bald patches. You examine its eyes, its mouth, its hooves. You're looking for any excuse to reject it. Because rejected animals mean the owner has to try again, which means more fees for the temple, which keeps your employers happy. Once the animal passes inspection, it must be washed. This is another purification ritual. The animal is led to a different basin than the one you used this morning, and water is poured over its head and body. The water must come from a sacred source. The pouring must be accompanied by specific prayers. If the animal struggles or cries out during this process, that's a bad omen, and the whole sacrifice might need to be rescheduled. Assuming the purification goes well, the animal is led to the altar. This is a dramatic moment, or it would be dramatic if it didn't happen several times every single morning. The altar is an elevated stone platform, usually positioned so the morning sun illuminates it. There's a fire burning on top, carefully maintained overnight by the night watch attendants. The owner of the sacrifice, or sometimes a priest, approaches the animal with a ceremonial knife. This is the moment of killing, and it's supposed to be quick and merciful. The throat is cut, and the blood flows down channels carved into the altar stone, ultimately draining into a collection basin. Here's where your duties become particularly unpleasant. That blood. It needs to be caught, because some of it will be sprinkled on the altar as an offering, and some of it has other uses. You're standing there, holding a ceremonial bowl, trying not to splash blood on your newly cleaned tunic, trying not to think about the fact that you'll be doing this again in a few hours with a different animal. The blood has a smell. It's hard to describe if you've never experienced it, but it's metallic and sweet and slightly nauseating all at once. On hot summer days, that smell hangs in the air around the temple like a physical presence. You get used to it, theoretically. The senior attendants claim you get used to it. But every morning, when that first throat is cut and that first wave of scent hits you, you wonder if you'll ever truly adapt. Once the animal is dead and the blood has been appropriately distributed, the real work begins: butchering. Now, ancient Greek sacrifice followed a very specific protocol. The gods got their share, and the humans got theirs. The trick was dividing things appropriately. The gods, in Greek religious practice, received the bones wrapped in fat. This might seem like the gods were getting a raw deal, but the burning bones and fat created smoke and aroma that ascended to the heavens, which was apparently what the gods actually wanted. The meat, meanwhile, was distributed among the priests, the sacrifice's owner, and sometimes shared with the community in a public feast. Your job is to help with this butchering process. And let me tell you, if you think you understand what butchering an animal entails, think again, because this isn't just cutting meat. This is precision religious anatomy. The hide must be removed carefully, in one piece when possible, because it's valuable and will be sold to benefit the temple. The organs must be examined for omens: the liver, the lungs, the heart. The priests will study these organs, looking for discolorations, abnormalities, anything that might indicate the god's pleasure or displeasure with the offering. The meat must be carved into specific portions. There's a hierarchy to who gets which cuts. The priests get the best portions, obviously. The sacrifice's owner gets a share proportional to what they paid. If it's a public sacrifice funded by the city, the meat might be distributed to citizens, or it might be sold in the market, with the proceeds going to the temple treasury. And you, standing there with blood up to your elbows, your clean tunic already stained despite your best efforts, you're learning which cuts go where, which portions are reserved for which purposes. The loin goes here, the shoulder goes there. The head is saved for a specific ritual. The feet will be used in making a soup for the temple staff's evening meal. This process repeats multiple times, every morning. Some days, particularly during major festivals, you might process dozens of animals. The scale of sacrifice at the larger temples was truly industrial. The great festival of Hecatombaion in Athens, for instance, involved the sacrifice of 100 oxen. 100. Imagine the logistics. Imagine the blood. Imagine the flies. Ah, yes, the flies. Nobody ever mentions the flies in those romantic descriptions of ancient Greek religion. But let me tell you, They were constant companions. By mid-morning, as the sun warmed the blood-stained stones and the offal waiting to be dealt with, the flies arrived in clouds. Fat, lazy flies, attracted by the smell of blood and burning flesh. They landed on your face, your arms, your hands. They crawled into the meat you were trying to butcher. They buzzed around your ears with that distinctive, maddening drone. You couldn't swat them away too vigorously because you needed your hands free for your work. You couldn't complain because silence was still technically required during ritual activities. You just had to endure them, these tiny embodiments of the less glorious aspects of religious service. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about the social structure of temple service, because this will help explain why you, specifically, wouldn't last in this role. Temple staffing was highly hierarchical. At the top were the priests, often drawn from elite families, sometimes holding their positions for life, sometimes chosen by lot. These were the men, and occasionally women, though that was rare and specific to certain cults, who actually performed the key rituals, who spoke the prayers, who interpreted the omens. Below them were various grades of attendants and servants. Some were permanent staff, essentially religious professionals who'd made a career of temple service. Others were temporary, fulfilling a religious obligation or working off a debt to the temple. And at the very bottom were people like you, hypothetical time traveler, the lowest rank temple servants, the ones who did the actual physical labor, the ones who swept and scrubbed and hauled and butchered. The permanent temple staff had adapted to this life. They'd found rhythms and routines that made it bearable. They'd developed calluses, both physical and psychological, that protected them from the worst aspects of the work. They'd learned the shortcuts, the tricks, the ways to make the days pass more quickly. You have none of these advantages. Every moment is new and shocking. Your hands aren't used to gripping a broom for hours. Your nose isn't acclimated to the smell of blood and burning fat. Your mind hasn't yet learned to go blank during repetitive tasks, to achieve that state of meditation through boredom that long-term temple servants mastered. And the senior attendants can tell. They can always tell when someone's new. They see you flinching when the knife cuts the sheep's throat. They see you struggling with the heavy water amphoras. They see you trying to suppress a gag when the wind shifts and brings the smell of the offal pit straight to your face. They're not unkind, mostly. They remember their own first days. But they're also not particularly sympathetic, because sympathy doesn't help anyone adapt. The work must be done. The gods must be served. Your personal discomfort is, in the grand scheme of things, utterly irrelevant. By mid-morning, you've already been working for several hours. You're exhausted. Your arms ache from sweeping and from holding heavy ceremonial objects. Your back hurts from bending over animal carcasses. Your feet are sore from standing on stone floors. Your tunic is stained with blood and ash and other substances you're trying not to think about. And now comes one of the most physically demanding tasks, hauling water. Greek temples used water in astonishing quantities. Water for purification basins, water for washing sacrificial animals, water for cleaning blood from the altar stones, water for the priest's ceremonial washings, water for dousing fires, water for a dozen other purposes you're still learning about. And all of this water has to come from somewhere. In the best-case scenario, there's a spring within the temple precinct. In that case, you're merely carrying water from the spring to various collection points around the temple complex. In the worst-case scenario, and, of course, you'd find yourself in the worst-case scenario, The nearest sacred water source is half a mile away, so you haul water. You and the other junior attendants working in a kind of miserable solidarity. You have amphoras, those distinctive Greek vessels with two handles, designed specifically for carrying liquids. When full, they're enormously heavy. 40, 50, 60 pounds, depending on the size. You lift one onto your shoulder, using a technique you're still learning that involves balancing the weight just so to avoid straining your back. Then you walk, and walk, and walk. From the spring to the temple. From the temple back to the spring. Again, and again, and again. The path becomes hypnotic in its familiarity. You learn every irregularity in the stone paving, every rise and dip. You learn which route has the most shade. You learn the rhythm that makes the carrying easiest, not too fast, which sloshes the water and wastes energy, not too slow, which prolongs the agony. Other junior attendants pass you going the opposite direction, their amphoras empty, ready to refill. Sometimes you make eye contact. Sometimes someone attempts a small, weary smile. Usually, you all just walk in silence, lost in your own private sufferings. This is ancient Greece. This is religious service. This is the reality behind all those noble marble statues and all those elegant philosophical dialogues. Somebody has to haul the water. Somebody has to scrub the blood from the stones. Somebody has to maintain the physical infrastructure of faith. Today, that somebody is you. And you're beginning to wonder how anyone does this for years, for decades, for a lifetime. Here's something that might surprise you. There's actually a break in the middle of the day. Not a long break, and certainly not a comfortable break, but a break nonetheless. The intense morning sacrifices typically conclude by midday. The meat has been distributed. The gods have received their portion of bones and fat. The altars have been cleaned. There's usually a period of several hours before the evening rituals begin. This doesn't mean you're free to relax. It means you transition to maintenance work, repairing equipment, organizing supplies, cleaning areas that weren't cleaned in the morning rush. Sometimes, if you're very unlucky, clearing out the offal pits. Actually, let's talk about the offal pits. These were essentially designated locations where all the animal waste that wasn't used in the sacrifice was deposited. Intestines, bladders, various organs deemed unsuitable for human consumption or divine offering. This material accumulated, and periodically, it needed to be cleared out. This was, universally, considered the worst job in the temple. The smell alone was enough to induce nausea. The visual aspect wasn't much better. And the physical labor of hauling this decomposing matter out of the pit and transporting it to some location outside the sacred precinct, where it could be buried or otherwise disposed of. This was back-breaking, disgusting work that nobody wanted. Naturally, as the newest junior attendant, you'd find yourself assigned to awful pit duty with impressive regularity. But let's say you've managed to avoid that particular fate today. Instead, you're working in the shade of the temple colonnade, helping to oil and maintain the ceremonial equipment. The knives need to be sharpened and polished. The bowls need to be cleaned and checked for cracks. The ritual garments need to be inspected and repaired. This work is quieter, more contemplative. The shade is welcome after the morning sun. You can hear the sounds of the city beyond the temple precinct, market vendors calling, children playing, the general hum of human activity. It reminds you that there's a world beyond this endless round of ritual and repetition. Some of the senior attendants tell stories during these afternoon maintenance sessions. Stories about the gods, mostly. Myths and legends and supposedly true accounts of divine intervention. The story of how this particular temple was founded. The story of a miraculous healing that occurred here. The story of the time a priest saw a vision during a sacrifice. You listen to these stories, and you try to connect them to your own experience. You try to feel some sense of religious awe, some connection to the divine that would make all this labor meaningful. Sometimes it works. Sometimes, for a moment, you feel a genuine, spiritual resonance. You remember why you wanted to serve in the first place. But mostly, you just feel tired. Deeply, profoundly tired in a way that goes beyond mere physical exhaustion. As the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, the temple awakens again. The evening rituals are generally shorter than the morning ones, but they follow a similar pattern. More sacrifices, though usually smaller. More prayers, more offerings. You've been working for almost 12 hours at this point. Your hands are raw. Your feet are aching. There's a persistent pain between your shoulder blades from all the hauling and carrying. You smell of smoke and blood and sweat, despite your multiple trips to the purification basins throughout the day. But you can't falter now. The evening rituals require the same attention, the same precision, the same absolute focus as the morning ones. The gods, after all, don't accept exhaustion as an excuse for sloppy service. You take your place in the evening procession. Torches are lit as darkness gathers. The priests begin their chanted prayers. The evening sacrifice begins. The blood flows again. The smoke rises again. The whole machinery of worship turns through another cycle, exactly as it has for generations, exactly as it will for generations more. And you realize, with a clarity that's almost enlightening, that this is your life now. This endless repetition, this constant physical labor in service of invisible gods, this cycle of purification and pollution, sacrifice and offering, dawn and dusk, day after day after day after day. Some people find meaning in this repetition. Some people find peace in the structured certainty of religious routine. Some people genuinely believe they're doing the most important work possible, maintaining the relationship between humanity and the divine. You're just trying to make it through to bedtime. Here's something interesting to consider as we approach the end of this first segment. How much did the average temple servant actually believe? This is a question historians have wrestled with, because ancient Greeks rarely wrote explicitly about their internal religious convictions. We have countless accounts of rituals performed, sacrifices made, oracles consulted, but we have very few documents that directly address whether the person performing these rituals actually believed in the literal existence and active involvement of Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and the rest of the pantheon. Modern scholars generally think that ancient Greek religion was more about orthopraxy than orthodoxy, about right practice rather than right belief. You could doubt the stories. You could question whether Zeus really turned into a swan to seduce Leda. You could be skeptical about whether Athena literally sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, but you absolutely could not skip the sacrifices. You could not neglect the rituals. You could not fail to honor the gods in the prescribed ways, because society itself was structured around these religious obligations. So picture yourself as a temple servant who's beginning to have doubts. Maybe the doubts started when you noticed that some sacrifices seemed to produce good omens, regardless of how the animal organs actually looked. Maybe the doubts intensified when you heard the priests discussing temple politics and finances in decidedly secular terms. Maybe the doubts culminated when you realized that the sacred mysteries you were helping to maintain were, at least in part, a very sophisticated form of theater designed to inspire awe in the population. What do you do with those doubts? Nothing. You do nothing, because your livelihood depends on this temple. Your social status, such as it is tied to your role here. And anyway, even if you personally doubt, even if you suspect the whole thing is an elaborate cultural performance, the rituals still need to be performed. The society still needs its religious institutions. So you haul the water and butcher the sheep and scrub the blood from the altar stones, and you keep your doubts to yourself, and you find whatever meaning you can in the work itself, in the physical reality of serving something larger than yourself, even if you're not entirely sure what that something is. Finally, as the last of the evening rituals concludes and darkness settles fully over the temple precinct, you're released to your quarters. You eat a simple meal: bread, olives, maybe some of the meat from today's sacrifices if you're fortunate. You're too tired to taste it. You're too tired to do much of anything except collapse onto your sleeping mat. Tomorrow, you'll wake before dawn and do it all again. And the day after that. And the day after that. For as long as you serve in this temple, lying there in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the other exhausted attendants around you, you understand something profound about ancient Greek religious life. It was work, hard, unceasing, physical work. It demanded discipline and endurance, and a certain willingness to subjugate your own comfort to the requirements of ritual. Could you do it? Could you wake up tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and repeat this entire exhausting cycle? Probably not. Most modern people couldn't. We're too accustomed to comfort, too used to having choices, too attached to the idea that work should be meaningful in some immediate, personally satisfying way. But the ancient Greeks who served in these temples, they didn't have those same expectations. They understood that some work was simply necessary, simply part of the fabric of keeping society functioning. And they did it, day after day, with a kind of quiet endurance that we can barely imagine. So as you drift off to sleep on your reed mat, exhausted beyond words, smelling of smoke and blood and sacred water, you finally understand the title of this segment: why you wouldn't last a day as a temple servant in ancient Greece. Not because you're weak, not because you're faithless, but because you're modern. And the ancient world operated according to rules and rhythms and requirements that the modern world has long since forgotten. Let's shift our focus now, away from the exhausting daily grind of the common temple servant, and toward something more rarefied, more mysterious, more laden with the weight of history and myth. We're traveling to Delphi, the Omphalos, the navel of the ancient Greek world. Picture the journey there, if you will. You're traveling from Athens, perhaps, or from one of the other great cities of Greece. The road winds through the mountains, climbing steadily upward. The air grows thinner, cooler. The landscape becomes more dramatic, more austere. Olive groves give way to rocky slopes. The sounds of civilization, the constant hum of the marketplace, the bleating of sheep, the calls of vendors gradually fade, replaced by the whisper of wind through mountain passes and the distant cry of eagles. Delphi sits on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, perched at an elevation that feels almost deliberately chosen to inspire awe. Below you, the valley spreads out in layers of green and gold, Above you, the mountain rises toward the sky, and ahead, carved into the mountainside itself, you see the gleaming marble of the sanctuary of Apollo. This is no ordinary temple complex. This is Delphi. For nearly 1,000 years, this was the most important oracle in the Greek world. Kings and generals, philosophers and peasants all made the pilgrimage here to consult the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo who spoke the god's prophetic truth. But we're not interested in the pilgrims today. We're interested in the Pythia herself, the woman who sat at the very center of this intricate religious machinery, the woman who breathed the sacred vapors and spoke words that launched wars, founded cities, and shaped the course of history. What was her life actually like? Strip away the mythology, the dramatic retellings, the legends that accumulated over centuries. What was the daily, lived experience of being the oracle at Delphi? The answer, as you might expect by now, involves rather more routine and rather less mystical ecstasy than you might imagine. Let's start with how one became the Pythia, because this already reveals something important about the role. In the earliest periods of Delphi's operation, the Pythia was a young virgin, chosen from among the local population. This made a certain narrative sense. The pure maiden, untouched by the corrupting influences of the world, able to channel divine wisdom with unclouded clarity. But then, something happened. The ancient sources are coy about the details, but they hint at a scandal. A young, beautiful Pythia, and a consultant who was rather too taken with her charms. An abduction, perhaps, or an attempted seduction. The kind of incident that forces an institution to reconsider its policies. After this incident, the rules changed. The Pythia was still required to be a virgin in the ritual sense. That is, she had to abstain from sexual relations once she assumed the role. But she was no longer required to be young. In fact, she was typically chosen from among older women, women past childbearing age, women who had already lived full lives before dedicating themselves to Apollo's service. Often, she was a widow. Often, she came from a respectable, but not aristocratic family. She needed to be literate, or at least capable of understanding and remembering complex questions. She needed to have a certain presence, a certain gravitas. She needed to be able to withstand the physical and mental demands of the role. And once chosen, she was in it for life. Or rather, for as long as she was physically capable of performing the duties. Because being the Pythia was not a temporary appointment. This was a calling, a complete transformation of identity. You ceased to be Aristodike or Themistoclea or whatever your birth name was. You became the Pythia. You became the voice of Apollo. You became, in a very real sense, a living conduit between the mortal and divine realms. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi is a structure we need to understand in some detail, because its physical layout shaped the Pythia's daily experience. The main temple sits on a terrace carved into the mountainside. Approaching it, you climb the sacred way, a winding path lined with treasuries, small temple-like structures built by various Greek city-states to house their offerings and advertise their piety. Each treasury is a miniature masterpiece of architecture, competing with its neighbors for attention and prestige. The temple itself is surrounded by columns, a classic Greek peripteral design. But it's what's inside the temple that matters for our purposes. The inner sanctum, the adyton, where the actual prophecies took place. This was a small, enclosed space deep within the temple, dim even during daylight hours. The air here had a particular quality, thick, slightly musty, tinged with the smell of incense, and something else. something mineral and vaguely sulphurous that came from deep within the earth. In the center of the adyton was the omphalos stone, a beehive-shaped rock that marked the exact center of the world, or so the Greeks believed. Near it was a spring, the Castalian spring, whose waters had purifying properties. And somewhere in this space, the exact configuration is still debated by archaeologists, was the source of the pneuma, the sacred vapor that the Pythia inhaled. There was a tripod, a three-legged bronze seat elevated above the floor. This is where the Pythia sat during prophetic sessions. The tripod itself was ancient, supposedly dating back to the founding of the oracle. It was tall enough that when the Pythia sat on it, her feet dangled above the ground, disconnecting her physically from the earth, even as the vapors rising from below connected her to the chthonic powers beneath. The lighting in the adyton was carefully controlled. Oil lamps provided just enough illumination to see, but not enough to dispel the shadows. The flickering flames created an atmosphere of mystery, of being suspended between the ordinary world and something else entirely. This was the Pythia's workspace. This was where she spent her prophetic days, breathing vapors and speaking oracles. Consultations at Delphi did not happen every day. This is important to understand. The Pythia was not available for drop-in questions whenever someone felt like asking. Oracle days followed a strict schedule. Originally, prophecies were given only once per year, on Apollo's birthday in the early spring. But as Delphi's fame grew and demand increased, the schedule expanded. Eventually, consultations were available once per month during the warmer months, 9 months of the year, excluding the 3 winter months when Apollo was believed to be absent from Delphi, leaving the sanctuary to Dionysus. On these consultation days, the process began early. The Pythia, like the temple servants we discussed earlier, rose before dawn. But her morning routine was different, more ritualized, more laden with significance. First, the purification. The Pythia didn't use the common purification basin. She bathed in the Castalian spring itself, the sacred water that flowed from high on Mount Parnassus. The spring was cold, mountain-fed, snowmelt, the kind of cold that steals your breath and makes your skin tingle, with a sensation somewhere between pain and electric awareness. She bathed completely, immersing herself in water that was believed to have prophetic properties in its own right. Ancient sources tell us that the water tasted of minerals and had a slightly effervescent quality, suggesting carbonation from deep geological sources. Drinking this water was part of the preparation, cleansing her not just externally but internally. After bathing, she dressed in specific ritual garments, not elaborate priestly robes, interestingly. The Pythia dressed simply, almost like an ordinary woman, though her clothing was ritually pure. She wore a laurel wreath, sacred to Apollo, on her head. She carried a branch of laurel in one hand. These were her identifying markers, the visual symbols of her role. Then came a crucial step. She chewed laurel leaves. Raw laurel, bitter and slightly numbing on the tongue. Laurel contains compounds that can have mild psychoactive effects, nothing dramatic, but enough to alter consciousness slightly, to create a sense of dissociation, of being one step removed from ordinary awareness. Was this intentional? Did the priests of Apollo know that laurel could affect mental states? Almost certainly. The Greeks were keen observers of plants and their properties. The systematic use of laurel in Delphic ritual suggests they understood at some level that it helped facilitate the prophetic state. Consultants who wished to question the oracle had to follow their own elaborate protocol. They couldn't simply show up and demand answers. First, they had to offer a preliminary sacrifice, usually a goat, outside the main temple. The animal's behavior during this sacrifice was observed closely. If it trembled when cold water was sprinkled on it, this was a good sign, indicating the gods were favorable. If it didn't tremble, the consultation might be postponed. Assuming the preliminary sacrifice was acceptable, the consultant paid a fee. The fee structure at Delphi was complex, with different rates for individuals, cities, and states. The wealthy paid more. Cities establishing colonies or contemplating wars paid substantially more. The fees funded the entire operation: the priests, the Pythia, the maintenance of the sanctuary, the countless attendants and servants who kept the machinery running. Then the consultant was led into the temple, though not immediately into the Adyton where the Pythia waited. There was a holding area, a place to collect one's thoughts, to formulate one's question carefully. Because the question mattered. The phrasing mattered. The Pythia did not respond to vague inquiries. What should I do with my life? Was too broad. Will I be successful? Was too undefined. The proper Delphic question was specific, often posed as a binary choice. Should I attack Persia, or should I sue for peace? Should I establish a colony in Sicily, or should I look to the west coast of Italy? Is my wife faithful, or is she committing adultery? When ready, the consultant was led into the Adyton. The space was dim, smoky with incense, filled with the peculiar smell of the vapors. The Pythia was already in place on her tripod, visible but somehow remote, sitting above the ordinary plane of existence. The consultant stated his question, clearly, once. There were no follow-up questions, no opportunities for clarification. You asked, and then you waited for the Pythia's response. And here's where it gets interesting, because the actual process of prophetic utterance was not what you might expect. The popular image of the Pythia is a woman in wild, ecstatic frenzy, thrashing about, screaming incomprehensible syllables while possessed by divine madness. This image comes from certain ancient sources, particularly Roman-era writers who were describing a Greek institution they didn't fully understand and perhaps wanted to exoticize. The reality, based on more careful historical analysis, was likely quite different. The Pythia probably did enter an altered state of consciousness. The vapors, the laurel, the sensory environment, and her own psychological preparation would have combined to create a trance-like condition. But it was a controlled trance, not a wild one. She spoke, sometimes in verse, sometimes in prose, sometimes clearly, sometimes in riddles. The exact nature of her utterances varied, but they were intelligible. Priests were present in the Adyton, probably two, standing nearby, but not interfering, and they heard and recorded what she said. Then, and this is crucial, the priests interpreted and formulated the official oracle. The Pythia's raw words were refined, shaped, turned into the polished, often ambiguous pronouncements that Delphi was famous for. This doesn't mean the Pythia was a fraud, puppet of cynical priests. It means the oracle was a collaborative process. The Pythia provided the inspired utterance, the raw prophetic material. The priests provided the theological and political sophistication to turn that material into useful guidance. Now, we need to talk about those vapors, the pneuma that the Pythia inhaled. What were they? Where did they come from? And did they actually exist? Or were they a myth added later to explain the Pythia's behavior? For centuries, scholars debated this question. The ancient sources clearly state that vapors rose from a chasm in the earth, and that the Pythia breathed these vapors to achieve her prophetic state. But when archaeologists excavated the Temple of Apollo in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found no chasm, no obvious source for vapors. The bedrock beneath the temple appeared solid. This led to a scholarly consensus that the vapors were fictional, a mythological element added to the Delphic story. The Pythia's trance state, according to this interpretation, was purely psychological, created through ritual, expectation, sensory manipulation, and, perhaps, the effects of laurel. But in the late 20th century, geologists took another look at the site, and they made a startling discovery. 2 geological faults intersect directly beneath the Temple of Apollo. These faults could, under certain conditions, release gases from deep within the earth. Analysis of the local geology suggested that these gases would include ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon that, when inhaled in small quantities, produces effects remarkably similar to those described for the Pythia: a sense of euphoria, dissociation, a feeling of being outside one's body, a loosening of normal cognitive constraints. Modern experiments with ethylene inhalation, conducted for medical purposes in the early 20th century, before safer anesthetics were developed, produced reports that sound remarkably similar to ancient descriptions of prophetic trance. Subjects reported feeling detached from their bodies, experiencing vivid mental imagery, speaking freely and without normal inhibitions. So the vapors were probably real. The Pythia was likely inhaling ethylene and possibly other gases released through geological activity. This doesn't diminish the religious significance of the oracle. If anything, it explains how the Delphic system could work reliably for centuries. The Pythia had access to a naturally occurring substance that facilitated the altered states necessary for her role. But, and this is important for understanding her lived experience, the gases weren't constantly flowing. Geological release of gases is intermittent, dependent on pressure buildups and release cycles. This probably explains why consultations could only happen on certain days. On oracle days, the gases were flowing. On other days, they weren't, and prophecy was impossible. The Pythia's life wasn't all trance states and divine pronouncements. In fact, most of her time was spent in ways that would seem quite ordinary. She lived in a designated residence within the sanctuary complex, not a grand palace. Remember, the Pythia was often a woman of modest origins, but a comfortable house, well-maintained, providing everything she needed. She had servants, though fewer than the high priests. She had access to the sanctuary's resources. But she also had restrictions. Once she became the Pythia, she was required to remain ritually pure. This meant abstaining from sex, as mentioned earlier. It also meant following dietary restrictions. Certain foods were off limits, particularly during the days leading up to consultations. Fish from certain waters, wine, except in ritual contexts. Anything that might pollute or cloud her prophetic abilities. She couldn't leave Delphi except in very unusual circumstances. Her life was bound to the sanctuary. If she had family elsewhere, children, perhaps, from her pre-Pythia life, she might see them if they visited. But she couldn't go to them. This must have been one of the hardest aspects of the role, this voluntary isolation from the ordinary flow of family life. Between oracle days, she had duties. She participated in other rituals at the sanctuary. She attended festivals. She maintained her own spiritual practice, whatever private devotions and meditations she felt necessary to keep herself prepared for the demands of prophecy. And she studied. Being the Pythia required significant knowledge. She needed to understand the history of previous oracles, the interpretation of various signs and portents. She needed to know the political landscape of the Greek world, who was fighting whom, which cities were ascendant, which were declining. This knowledge informed her responses, helped her provide relevant guidance, even when in a trance state. The priests of Apollo almost certainly briefed her regularly. The Athenians are considering war with Sparta. Thebes is sending a delegation. They'll likely ask about their crops. There's a wealthy merchant coming from Corinth who's known to be superstitious and easily influenced. This wasn't deception, it was preparation. The Pythia was expected to provide useful guidance, and useful guidance requires context. Consider the psychological burden of being the Pythia. When you spoke, you weren't just offering personal advice. You were, supposedly, channeling the voice of Apollo himself. Your words would be analyzed, debated, acted upon. Your prophecies could lead to wars or prevent them. Your guidance could save cities or doom them. The ambiguity of Delphic oracles, their famous tendency toward statements that could be interpreted multiple ways, was partly a defensive mechanism. If your prophecy could be read in multiple ways, you couldn't be definitively wrong. The responsibility for interpretation fell partly on the consultant and partly on fate itself. But still, the weight must have been enormous. Every month during the consultation season, you climbed onto that tripod, breathed those vapors, and spoke words that would ripple outward through the Greek world. Sometimes your words would be remembered for generations. Sometimes they would be forgotten. But you never knew which would be which when you spoke them. Ancient sources record that some Pythias served for decades, 40 years, 50 years, an entire adult lifetime spent in this role speaking for the god, carrying the expectations of thousands upon thousands of consultants. How did they cope? How did they maintain their sanity under such pressure? Perhaps through that very routine we've been discussing, the daily rituals, the predictable schedule of consultation days, the familiar physical space of the adyton, the support of the priests who managed the practical details and shared the burden of responsibility, and perhaps through genuine faith. If you truly believed that you were Apollo's chosen vessel, that the words flowing through you came from divine source rather than your own mind, then the responsibility shifted. You weren't accountable for the content of the prophecies. Apollo was. You were merely the instrument, the medium. This belief might have been psychologically essential for long-term survival in the role. We can't talk about the Pythia's life without acknowledging the political dimensions of her role. Delphi was not some isolated, purely spiritual institution. It was deeply embedded in the political and economic networks of the Greek world. City-states competed for influence at Delphi. They built those treasuries along the sacred way partly as religious offerings, but also as advertisements of their wealth and power. They sent expensive gifts to the sanctuary. They courted the favor of the priests. And sometimes, let's be honest about this, they tried to influence the oracles themselves. There are recorded instances where the Delphic priests were accused of bias, of giving favorable oracles to cities that had been particularly generous with their donations. The most famous case involved the Spartan king Cleomenes, who allegedly bribed the Pythia to declare his rival Demaratus illegitimate. When this corruption was discovered, both the Pythia and the complicit priests were deposed. But think about what this incident reveals. It reveals that influencing the Pythia was unusual enough, shocking enough, to cause a major scandal when discovered. The normal expectation was that the Pythia was incorruptible, that her prophecies were genuine. How did the Pythia navigate these political pressures? She had protection in the form of her ritual role. She could always, claim that her words came from Apollo, not from her own political calculations. If a powerful city-state was unhappy with an oracle, they might blame the priest's interpretation, but they rarely blamed the Pythia herself. She was insulated by her sacred status. Still, she wasn't naive. She lived in the sanctuary. She heard the gossip. She knew which cities had given generous offerings and which hadn't. She knew when consultants came with questions that were really tests of Delphi's loyalty or wisdom. And while in her trance state she might have genuinely felt divinely inspired, in her normal state she was a human woman, intelligent enough to understand the complex game being played around her. Eventually, every Pythia reached the end of her service, through age, illness, or death. What happened then? The transition to a new Pythia was handled with great care. The old Pythia, if she was retiring rather than dying in office, would typically participate in the selection and training of her successor. She would pass on the accumulated knowledge, the tricks of the trade, the understanding of how to enter and navigate the prophetic state. This knowledge transfer was crucial because, despite all the ritual preparation and the vapors and the mystical trappings, being an effective Pythia required learned skills. You had to know how to breathe the vapors without becoming completely incapacitated. You had to know how to maintain enough conscious control to speak coherently while allowing yourself to enter the dissociative state that facilitated prophecy. You had to learn the rhythm of prophetic speech, the cadence that made your utterances sound inspired rather than merely confused. These were techniques, refined over centuries, passed from one Pythia to the next, in an unbroken chain stretching back to the oracle's legendary founding. When a new Pythia took her first seat on the tripod, it was both a beginning and a continuation. She was an individual woman with her own personality, her own voice, her own understanding of the divine. But she was also joining a tradition, becoming part of something much larger than herself. Let's end this segment by trying to inhabit the Pythia's subjective experience during an actual prophetic session. This is speculative, of course. We have no first-person accounts from the Pythia herself, but based on what we know about the physical setup, the substances involved, and the descriptions from outside observers, we can construct a reasonable approximation. You've completed your purifications. You've chewed the laurel leaves, feeling the slight numbness spread through your mouth. You've been led into the Adyton. The dim space, so familiar after years of service, surrounds you. The smell of incense mingles with that peculiar mineral scent from the vapors. You climb onto the tripod. The bronze is cool under your hands. You settle into position, your feet dangling, your body balanced. The priests take their positions on either side, visible in your peripheral vision but not demanding your attention. You breathe, slowly, deeply. The vapors are flowing today. You can tell by the increased intensity of the smell, by the slight sweetness in the air. You breathe them in. Once, twice, 3 times. The effects come on gradually. First, a sense of lightness, as if your body is becoming less substantial, less anchored to the physical world. The dim light of the Adyton seems to shimmer slightly. The boundaries between objects become less distinct. You're aware of your surroundings, but they seem distant, as if you're perceiving them through a veil. Your hearing becomes acute. You can hear the breathing of the priests, the distant sounds from outside the temple, the faint whisper of air moving through the Adyton. But these sounds don't feel external anymore. They seem to arise from within your own consciousness, as if the boundary between inner and outer has dissolved. Then the consultant speaks, asking his question. You hear the words, understand them, but they seem to come from very far away, and somewhere in your mind an answer forms, or rather words form. You're not entirely sure where they come from, whether they arise from your own knowledge and understanding, whether they're suggested by some unconscious processing of information you've accumulated, or whether they do, in fact, come from some external source, some presence or intelligence beyond yourself. In your altered state, it doesn't matter. The words are there, and you speak them. Your voice sounds strange to your own ears, both yours and not yours. The words flow out, sometimes smoothly, sometimes in starts and stops. Sometimes they rhyme, following patterns you didn't consciously intend. Sometimes they're obscure, using metaphors and images that surprise you even as you speak them. The priests are writing, recording. You're aware of this on some level, but it doesn't concern you. Your job is to speak. Their job is to capture and interpret. The division of labor is clear. When the words stop flowing, when the answer is complete, you remain on the tripod for a moment, breathing, allowing the effects of the vapors to gradually diminish. The room slowly resolves back into normal perception. Your body remembers its weight. The priests become fully present again, rather than shadowy presences at the edge of awareness. You climb down from the tripod. Your legs are slightly unsteady. They always are after a session. The priests help you to a chair, offer you water. You drink, washing away the last taste of laurel, grounding yourself back in ordinary consciousness. Another prophecy complete, another consultation finished. The cycle continues. This is the life of the Pythia, not constant divine ecstasy, not unending mystical communion with Apollo, but rather a structured practice, repeated regularly, requiring skill and endurance and a certain psychological flexibility, a willingness to open yourself to altered states, to speak from a place beyond normal conscious control, while still maintaining enough presence to fulfill your duties. Some months you might give a dozen prophecies, speaking to consults from across the Greek world. Other months, particularly in winter, you give none at all. Your life follows the rhythm of the oracle's schedule, the ebb and flow of geological gases beneath the temple, the cycles of the sacred calendar. And through it all, you remain the Pythia. Not quite a priestess, not quite a prophet, not quite a performer. Something uniquely your own, the living voice of Apollo at Delphi, the most famous oracle in the ancient world. Now, we descend deeper into uncertainty, into questions that even centuries of scholarship haven't fully resolved. We've established what the oracle looked like from the outside, what the daily life of the Pythia might have been, but there remain profound mysteries at the heart of the Delphic oracle and Greek divination more broadly. Questions without definitive answers. Puzzles that historians and archaeologists continue to debate. And, for our purposes tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, these unresolved mysteries provide the perfect landscape for the mind to wander through on its way to sleep. Let's begin with the most fundamental question. Did the oracles actually work? When we strip away the mythology and the religious interpretation, when we look at the historical record with clear eyes, did the Pythia and other Greek oracles provide genuinely useful guidance? Or was the whole system an elaborate exercise in cold reading, vague pronouncements, and after-the-fact rationalization? The answer, frustratingly and fascinatingly, is complicated. There are well-documented cases where Delphic oracles seem to have provided remarkably accurate and specific guidance. Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, famously tested multiple oracles by asking them to describe what he was doing on a specific day at a specific time. According to Herodotus, the Delphic oracle correctly stated that he was boiling a lamb and a tortoise together in a bronze cauldron. A deliberately bizarre activity he'd chosen precisely because it would be impossible to guess. This, if true, suggests something beyond mere lucky guessing or vague pronouncements that could be interpreted multiple ways. But we should be cautious with such stories. They come to us filtered through sources written decades or centuries after the events, by authors who had their own reasons to portray Delphi as supernaturally effective. We don't have Croesus's own account, authenticated and dated. We have a story about Croesus, told by a Greek historian, shaped by the narrative conventions and cultural assumptions of his time. Still, even accounting for exaggeration and mythologization, the persistence of Delphi's reputation over such a long period suggests it was providing something that clients found valuable. Whether that was genuine prophetic insight, sophisticated political advice, dressed in religious language, or merely the psychological comfort of receiving guidance from a prestigious source. The ambiguity of Delphic pronouncements has become proverbial. The most famous example is probably the oracle given to Croesus when he was considering whether to attack Persia. The Pythia told him that if he crossed the Halys River and attacked, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged by this, Croesus attacked and was decisively defeated by the Persian king Cyrus. The great empire destroyed was his own. When he complained to Delphi about this misleading oracle, the priests pointed out that the prophecy had been entirely accurate. He had simply misunderstood which empire would be destroyed. This story, whether literally true or not, illustrates an important aspect of how Delphic oracles functioned. They were structured to be unfalsifiable. If an oracle seemed to be proven wrong by events, this wasn't a failure of prophecy, but a failure of interpretation. The fault lay with the consultant who misunderstood, not with Apollo who had spoken truly. This is brilliant from an institutional perspective. It means Delphi's reputation could survive even spectacular failures, but it also raises questions about the utility of such oracles. If any outcome could be retroactively interpreted as fulfilling the prophecy, was the prophecy actually providing useful information? Or was it merely a blank screen onto which consultants projected their own expectations and then found what they expected to find? Modern cognitive psychology would suggest the latter. Humans are extraordinarily good at finding patterns and meaning, even in random data. We're so good at it that we do it constantly, unconsciously, seeing faces in clouds and hearing voices in white noise, and finding significance in coincidence. But let's not be too quick to dismiss the entire Delphic system as mere psychological manipulation and confirmation bias. Because there's another possibility, one that's harder to quantify but worth considering. The Pythia, the priests, and the entire Delphic establishment had access to information that most consultants didn't have. They were at the center of a vast network of travelers, pilgrims, and messengers coming from every corner of the Greek world and beyond. They heard news, gossip, intelligence. They knew which cities were planning wars before those plans became public. They knew which politicians were rising and which were falling. They knew which trade routes were thriving and which were disrupted. They knew, in other words, a lot about the political and economic reality of their world. So, when a consultant asked whether they should establish a colony in a particular location, the Delphic priests might genuinely know things relevant to that decision. things about the fertility of the land, the presence of hostile tribes, the interests of competing powers that the consultant didn't know. They could incorporate this knowledge into their guidance, dressing it in religious language, but basing it on real intelligence. From this perspective, Delphi wasn't primarily a supernatural institution, but an information clearinghouse, a place where data from across the Mediterranean world was collected, analyzed, and redistributed in the form of oracular advice. The religious framing gave the advice authority and made people willing to pay substantial fees for it, but the actual value was in the information itself. This interpretation is appealing in its rationality, but it probably goes too far in the opposite direction. It reduces the oracle to a kind of ancient consulting firm, which doesn't capture the genuine religious belief and spiritual experience that seem to have been central to the institution. The Pythia, sitting on her tripod breathing ethylene and laurel, probably did experience genuine altered states of consciousness. She probably did feel that something beyond her ordinary self was speaking through her. Whether we interpret this as divine possession, as an eruption of unconscious material into consciousness, or as a chemically induced dissociative state, doesn't change the phenomenological reality of her experience. She believed, and her belief was real and consequential, regardless of its metaphysical accuracy. The consultants believed, most of them, genuinely believed that they were receiving divine guidance. This belief shaped their actions, gave them confidence or caution, provided a framework for understanding and responding to their circumstances. In a very real sense, the oracle worked because everyone believed it worked. The system was sustained not primarily by accurate predictions, but by faith, tradition, and the human need for guidance in an uncertain world. Now, let's broaden our focus beyond Delphi, because the Delphic oracle, famous though it was not the only oracular institution in ancient Greece. Far from it. The Greek world was filled with sites where mortals could communicate with the divine, each with its own methods, its own traditions, its own claims to authenticity. There were oracles of Zeus at Dodona and Olympia, where prophecies were derived from the rustling of oak leaves or the flight patterns of birds. There were healing oracles at temples of Asclepius, where the sick would sleep in the temple precinct and receive curative dreams. There were necromantic oracles where specialists claimed to summon and question the dead. There were oracles based on drawing lots, oracles based on interpreting sacrificial victims, oracles based on reading patterns in smoke or water or scattered grain. The Greeks, it seems, were absolutely committed to the idea that the future could be known, that divine will could be discerned, that uncertainty could be reduced through proper ritual and consultation with the gods. But why? Why were oracles so central to Greek culture? What was it about the Greek worldview that made divination not just possible, but necessary? Part of the answer lies in the Greek conception of fate and free will, which was complex and often contradictory. The Greeks believed in fate, in Moira, the portion or destiny allotted to each person. The major events of your life, particularly your death, were predetermined. No amount of effort or cleverness could truly escape your fate. And yet, within this framework, humans still had agency, still made choices that mattered. How could both be true? How could fate be fixed while human action remained meaningful? The oracles provided a way to navigate this paradox. By consulting an oracle, you could learn something about your fate without completely surrendering your agency. You could adjust your actions in light of what you learned. You might not be able to avoid your ultimate destiny, but you could perhaps shape the path toward it, minimize suffering, maximize opportunities. The oracle was a kind of interface between the fixed reality of fate and the fluid reality of human choice. Of course, this created its own paradoxes. If you learned from an oracle that you would suffer a particular misfortune and then took actions to avoid it, were you changing your fate or fulfilling it? The story of Oedipus is the classic exploration of this question. His parents learned from an oracle that their son would kill his father and marry his mother. Trying to prevent this, they abandoned the infant Oedipus. This action set in motion the chain of events that led to the prophecy's fulfillment. The attempt to avoid fate became the means by which fate was accomplished. This is disturbing, almost cruel in its implications. It suggests that knowledge of the future doesn't empower you to change it, but instead traps you into enacting it. And yet the Greeks continued to consult oracles, continued to seek knowledge of what was to come, even knowing that such knowledge might be as much a curse as a blessing. Perhaps they simply couldn't help themselves. Humans are prediction machines. Our brains are constantly trying to anticipate what comes next, to model future states, to plan and prepare. Uncertainty is cognitively uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable. An ambiguous oracle, a prophecy that could be interpreted multiple ways, might seem useless from a purely logical standpoint, but psychologically, it's better than no guidance at all. It gives the mind something to work with, a framework for organizing anxiety about the future into a structured narrative. Even if that narrative turns out to be wrong, even if the interpretation proves misguided, the act of consulting the oracle and receiving a response serves a function. It converts paralyzing uncertainty into manageable ambiguity. It transforms the overwhelming question of what will happen into the more tractable question of what the oracle meant. This is, in its way, a profound psychological service, and perhaps this more than any supposed accuracy was what kept people returning to Delphi and other oracles generation after generation. Let's consider now the specific mechanisms by which Greek oracles operated, because the variety is remarkable, and each method reveals something about Greek assumptions, about how divine communication worked. At Dodona, in northwestern Greece, the oracle of Zeus was based on interpreting natural sounds. The sanctuary contained a sacred oak tree, and priests would listen to the rustling of its leaves in the wind, discerning patterns that conveyed Zeus's will. How did this work? How did one distinguish meaningful rustling from mere wind? The ancient sources don't tell us the specific techniques, but we can make some educated guesses. Probably the priests, through long practice, had learned to enter a meditative or trance state while listening to the leaves. In that altered state of consciousness, patterns would emerge, or seem to emerge. The random rustling would resolve into something that felt like meaning, like communication. Whether this was genuine divine communication, unconscious pattern finding by the human brain, or something in between depends on your metaphysical commitments. But the experiential reality for the priests was probably that they heard messages in the leaves. Bird divination, augury, was another widespread method. The flight patterns of birds, their calls, their behavior, all could be interpreted as signs from the gods. This made a certain intuitive sense in the Greek worldview. Birds moved between earth and sky, between the mortal realm and the realm of the gods. They were natural messengers, natural intermediaries. An eagle soaring overhead might indicate Zeus's favor. A crow's harsh call might be an omen of conflict or death. flocks of migrating birds might indicate favorable conditions for travel or war. Some of this had a basis in empirical observation. Birds do respond to weather conditions, to seasonal changes, to the presence of threats. A priest who'd spent years watching birds would genuinely know things about atmospheric conditions and seasonal patterns that could inform practical decisions about agriculture or navigation. But augury went beyond practical meteorology. It became a complex interpretive system where every detail mattered. The direction of flight, the height, the speed, the bird's behavior before and after. Calling, the time of day, the position relative to the observer, all these factors were considered significant and required interpretation according to traditional rules. This created a situation where virtually anything a bird did could be read as meaningful, and the meaning could be adjusted to fit the circumstances. If you needed an omen favoring your proposed course of action, a skilled augur could probably find one. If you needed justification for caution, that too could be found in the bird's behavior. This flexibility made augury extremely useful for political and military leaders. It provided a way to justify decisions to followers and allies while maintaining the appearance of divine sanction. We know from historical accounts that Roman generals, who inherited Greek augury traditions, sometimes manipulated the auspices, interpreting signs favorably or unfavorably, depending on what they wanted to do. The Greeks almost certainly did the same, though they were less explicit about it in their writings. Does this mean augury was fraudulent? That the augurs were cynical manipulators? Not necessarily. Belief and interpretation are not mutually exclusive. An augur could genuinely believe that the gods spoke through birds, while also understanding that the interpretation of bird behavior allowed for considerable flexibility. He could sincerely look for divine guidance in the flights of eagles, while also being aware that his own expectations and desires influenced what he saw. Human cognition is perfectly capable of holding these contradictions simultaneously. Dream incubation at healing sanctuaries represents yet another form of Greek divination, and one that's particularly interesting from a psychological perspective. If you were suffering from illness, you could travel to a sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of healing. After appropriate sacrifices and purifications, you would spend the night sleeping within the temple precinct, often in a special dormitory called an abaton. During the night, you would receive a dream, supposedly sent by Asclepius himself. In this dream, the god might appear and cure you directly, or he might provide instructions, prescribe treatments, identify the cause of your illness. In the morning, you would report your dream to the temple priests, who would help interpret it and recommend appropriate follow-up actions. The walls of these healing sanctuaries were covered with inscriptions from grateful patients describing their cures. The god appeared to me in my dream, one might read, and told me to bathe in the sacred spring and avoid wine for 3 months. I did so and was cured. Or the god sent a sacred dog to lick my wound, and in the morning it was healed. These testimonials are fascinating documents. Some describe cures that sound plausibly related to the prescribed treatments, things like dietary changes or herbal remedies that might have had genuine therapeutic effects. Others describe miraculous overnight cures of chronic conditions, stories that strain credulity, but that the authors clearly believed were true. What was actually happening at these healing sanctuaries? Several factors were probably at work. First, the journey to the sanctuary itself, the ritual preparations, the atmosphere of faith and expectation, all would have created a strong placebo effect. We know from modern medicine that placebo effects can be quite powerful, particularly for conditions with subjective symptoms like pain. Second, the priests at these sanctuaries accumulated practical medical knowledge over generations of treating patients. They might have genuine expertise in herbal remedies, wound care, dietary interventions. This knowledge could be conveyed to patients as divine revelation, making it more authoritative and more likely to be followed. Third, the dream experience itself, facilitated by the unfamiliar sleeping environment, the stress of illness, possibly by medicinal herbs or mild intoxicants, created an opportunity for the unconscious mind to process and potentially resolve psychological factors contributing to illness. We know that stress, anxiety, and depression can exacerbate or even cause physical symptoms. A powerful dream experience that provided hope, reduced anxiety, or resolved psychological conflicts could lead to measurable improvement in physical health. And finally, let's not discount spontaneous remission. Many illnesses improve on their own given time. A patient who happened to improve after visiting an Asclepian sanctuary would naturally attribute the cure to divine intervention, particularly if the improvement coincided with a memorable dream. The sanctuary got credit for cures that would have happened anyway, while the failures, the patients who visited and weren't cured or who died, left fewer records, were less likely to commission grateful inscriptions. This created a survivorship bias in the testimonial evidence, making the sanctuaries appear more effective than they actually were. None of this means the healing sanctuaries were fraudulent, or that the patients who reported cures were lying. It means that multiple natural explanations can account for the reported phenomena without requiring actual divine intervention. But from the perspective of an ancient Greek patient, the distinction wouldn't have mattered much. Whether Asclepius literally appeared in dreams or whether the healing resulted from natural processes facilitated by the sanctuary's practices, the outcome was the same. Some people felt better after visiting. That was sufficient reason to maintain faith in the institution. The mechanics of lot oracles present their own interesting questions. At some oracular sites, questions were answered by drawing marked stones or beans from a container. This seems like the purest form of random chance, devoid of any interpretive flexibility. You posed a yes or no question, drew a lot marked yes or no, and received your answer. How could this possibly provide useful guidance? And yet, lot oracles were popular and widely used, particularly for relatively straightforward decisions. The psychological mechanism here is probably different from oracles that relied on interpretation. Drawing a lot externalizes decision-making, removes it from the realm of conscious choice. This can be useful when you're genuinely uncertain, or when competing considerations make a decision difficult. The lot makes the decision for you, which allows you to commit fully to a course of action without second-guessing or regret. It's not so different from modern people flipping a coin to make a decision, except that the Greeks invested the process with divine authority. The lot wasn't just random chance. It was the gods expressing their will through chance, guiding the outcome. This belief could provide considerable psychological relief. If you drew a lot telling you to pursue a risky venture, and it failed, you could comfort yourself that you had followed divine guidance, and the failure was fated. If you drew a lot telling you not to pursue the venture, you were spared the agony of wondering what if, because the gods themselves had indicated that path wasn't meant for you. There's also evidence that some lot oracles weren't as random as they appeared. Clever priests could potentially rig the drawing, marking stones in ways that allowed them to be distinguished by touch, or using containers that could be tilted to make certain stones more likely to be drawn. We don't have definitive proof of such manipulation at any specific sanctuary, but we do have accusations in ancient sources, suggestions that some oracles were corrupted, that priests would rig outcomes in favor of wealthy or influential consultants. Whether these accusations were true, or merely the complaints of disappointed consultants who got answers they didn't like, we can't always determine. But the very existence of such accusations tells us that ancient Greeks understood their oracles were operated by humans, humans who might have human failings, human susceptibility to bribes or political pressure. The system wasn't perceived as perfectly pure and incorruptible, even by believers. It was understood as a human institution claiming divine authority, and that claim was always open to question, always vulnerable to skepticism. And there were skeptics, even in the ancient world. Not everyone believed in the efficacy of oracles. Xenophanes, a pre-Socratic philosopher, mocked the anthropomorphic conception of gods that underlay Greek religion. Thucydides, the historian, was notably skeptical about oracles and prophecies, suggesting that people interpreted them to fit events after the fact. The playwright Euripides, in several of his works, portrayed oracles as ambiguous, potentially misleading, or even cruel in their accuracy. These skeptical voices never dominated Greek culture, but they were present, providing an undercurrent of doubt, a questioning of whether the oracles really worked as advertised. Interestingly, this skepticism didn't destroy the oracular institutions. Delphi continued to function for centuries after skeptical philosophers questioned its validity. People continued to consult oracles, even while acknowledging, at least in some contexts, that the prophecies might not be literally true or might be subject to manipulation. This suggests that the oracles served functions beyond their ostensible purpose of predicting the future. They were social institutions, sites of religious pilgrimage, centers of cultural identity. They provided ritual structure for important life decisions. They offered a way to frame uncertainty and anxiety. All of these functions could persist, even if belief in literal divine communication wavered. The decline of the oracles came not from internal skepticism, but from external factors. The rise of Christianity, with its very different conception of prophecy and divine communication, undermined the religious framework that supported Greek oracles. Christian authorities actively discouraged consultation of pagan oracles, viewing them as demonic rather than divine. Political changes also mattered. As the Roman Empire centralized power, the autonomous Greek city-states that had been the primary consultants of oracles lost their independence. They no longer needed to consult Delphi about whether to go to war or establish colonies, because those decisions were now made by Roman governors and emperors. The last recorded Delphic oracle was given in 393 CE, and it was fittingly ambiguous, supposedly telling the Emperor Theodosius that the oracle could no longer speak, that its prophetic voice had been silenced. Whether this was a genuine final prophecy or a later invention is unclear, but it serves as a fitting end to the tradition, the oracle announcing its own obsolescence in characteristically oracular language. What remains after all this examination of mechanisms and skepticism and historical context? What can we actually say about the mystery of Greek oracles? Perhaps only this: they were complex human institutions operating at the intersection of religion, politics, psychology, and culture. They provided something that Greek society needed, or believed it needed, a way to navigate uncertainty by appealing to divine authority. Whether the oracles actually provided access to divine knowledge, whether the gods really spoke through the Pythia at Delphi and the priests at Dodona and the dreams at Epidaurus, is a question that cannot be answered by historical investigation alone. It's a question of metaphysics, of what you believe about the nature of reality and the possibility of divine communication. What we can say is that millions of ancient Greeks believed in these oracles, consulted them, organized their lives around the guidance received, and found in them something valuable enough to sustain the institutions for over 1,000 years. That alone makes them worthy of our attention and our wondering, as we drift through these ancient mysteries on our way toward sleep. We've talked about the exhausted temple servants hauling water before dawn. We've talked about the Pythia breathing vapors and speaking prophecies. We've talked about the mysterious mechanisms of divination. Now, let's talk about something that ancient sources often preferred to obscure, something that sat uncomfortably alongside all that religious devotion and divine communication: money. Because Greek temples weren't just spiritual institutions. They were economic powerhouses, repositories of staggering wealth, employers of hundreds or thousands of people, landlords and moneylenders and political players. To understand Greek religion fully, you have to understand the economics that sustained it, the vast flows of wealth that made all those rituals and prophecies and daily sacrifices possible. Let's start with the most obvious source of temple income: offerings and dedications. When you consulted an oracle, you paid a fee. When you made a sacrifice, you paid for the sacrificial animal and for the services of the priests who would perform the ritual. When you sought healing at an Asclepian sanctuary, you paid for accommodations and for the interpretive services of the temple staff. When you were grateful for a favor from the gods, for recovery from illness or success in business or safe return from a journey, you might dedicate a gift, an offering, a thank you present to the deity. These offerings ranged from the modest to the spectacular. A poor farmer might dedicate a simple clay figurine, purchased from vendors who set up shop outside major temples. A successful merchant might dedicate a bronze statue. A victorious general might dedicate weapons and armor captured from enemies. A grateful city-state might build an entire treasury building, a small temple within the sanctuary complex, filled with precious objects and inscribed with declarations of piety and gratitude. Over time, over decades and centuries, these offerings accumulated. Temples became museums of sorts, filled with artifacts from across the Greek world and beyond. Walk through the sanctuary of Olympia or Delphi at their height, and you would see literally thousands of statues, vessels, weapons, pieces of armor, tripods, shields, all dedicated by individuals in cities over generations. Some were artistically significant, masterpieces of bronze working or sculpture. Others were historically important, commemorating famous victories or significant events. All of them had value, both symbolic and, crucially, material, because bronze could be melted down, gold could be minted into coins, precious fabrics could be repurposed. The temples sat on mountains of wealth disguised as piety. Now, the priests generally didn't just sell off these dedications for cash. That would be sacrilegious, a violation of the sacred trust. But they could use them as collateral. They could lend money against them. They could, in times of crisis, melt down some of the older, less significant offerings to mint coins, always with the understanding that the loan would be repaid or the dedication replaced. The line between treasury and temple was often quite blurry. City-states stored their financial reserves in temples, both because the temples had secure storage and because stealing from a temple was not just a crime, but a sacrilege, deterring potential thieves. But once the city's gold was sitting in the temple treasury next to the god's gold, the practical distinction became less clear. Priests might lend city funds, charge interest, use the returns to maintain the sanctuary. The god's wealth and the city's wealth became entangled in complex ways that probably varied from place to place and evolved over time. Land was another major source of temple wealth. Sanctuaries owned vast tracts of territory, acquired through donations, bequests, and outright purchase. This land was farmed, sometimes by temple slaves, sometimes by free tenants who paid rent to the temple. The income from these agricultural operations could be substantial. The Temple of Apollo at Delos, for instance, owned significant property across several islands, producing olive oil, grain, and wine. The Temple of Hera at Samos owned land both on the island and on the nearby mainland. These weren't just symbolic holdings. They were working farms, managed with attention to productivity and profit. Temple administrators had to be farmers as much as priests, understanding crop yields and tenant relationships and market prices. Some temples also owned urban properties, houses and workshops that they rented out. The sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, for example, owned properties in nearby towns that generated rental income. This diversified the temple's economic base, made them less vulnerable to agricultural failures or shifts in religious fashion. Even if pilgrims stopped coming, even if sacrifices declined, the rents still came in, the farms still produced, the economic engine kept running. Temples also functioned as banks, lending money at interest to individuals and cities. This was a natural extension of their role as repositories of wealth. If you had substantial assets sitting idle in a treasury, why not lend them out and collect interest? The Greeks didn't have the same religious prohibitions against usury that would later develop in Christian and Islamic societies. Lending at interest was considered a legitimate business activity, and temples engaged in it extensively. The interest rates varied depending on the borrower's creditworthiness and the purpose of the loan. Cities borrowing for public works might get favorable rates. Private individuals borrowing for commercial ventures might pay higher rates. The temples kept detailed records of these loans, inscribed on stone tablets that have, in some cases, survived to the present. These records are fascinating documents, revealing the scope and sophistication of temple banking operations. They show loans being made, repaid, renegotiated, sometimes defaulted upon. They show temples actively managing their investment portfolios, seeking returns while managing risk. But lending money created complications. What happened when borrowers defaulted? Could a temple seize collateral? Could it take debtors to court? Technically, the money belonged to the god, not to the human administrators. Did the god want his debtors pursued legally? Did the god care about maximizing returns? Or was divine wealth supposed to operate according to different principles than mortal wealth? These questions probably didn't have universal answers. Different sanctuaries probably handled them differently, depending on local customs and the personalities of the priests in charge. But the questions themselves reveal the tension between the religious and economic functions of temples. a tension that was always present even if ancient sources rarely addressed it directly. Festival organization was another economic aspect of temple operations, and one that brings us closer to something resembling modern event management. Major religious festivals weren't just spiritual occasions. They were massive social and economic events, drawing thousands of participants, requiring extensive logistical preparation, generating substantial income and expenses. Consider the Olympic Games, held every 4 years at the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. This wasn't just an athletic competition. It was a pan-Hellenic festival, a gathering of Greeks from across the Mediterranean world. Athletes came to compete, certainly, but they were accompanied by trainers, supporters, families. Politicians came to network and make deals. Artists and performers came to showcase their work. Merchants came to sell food, wine, and goods. Prostitutes came to ply their trade. It was a temporary city, springing up around the sanctuary for the duration of the festival, requiring food and water and sanitation and security. The sanctuary administration had to coordinate all of this. They had to arrange for adequate water supplies, manage waste disposal, provide spaces for vendors, maintain order among the crowds. They had to organize the athletic competitions themselves, recruit judges, maintain the facilities, distribute prizes. The prizes at Olympia were famously simple, just olive wreaths, but winning brought enormous prestige that athletes could convert into wealth through other means. The sanctuary didn't directly profit from prize money, but it profited from everything else. The fees paid by vendors for space in the marketplace, the offerings made by grateful victors and their sponsors, the increased prestige that kept donations flowing in the years between festivals. The Pythian Games at Delphi, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games, all followed similar patterns. Religious festivals became opportunities for economic activity, for cities to showcase their wealth, for individuals to gain fame, for merchants to make profits. The sanctuary sat at the center of these economic webs, taking their cut, managing the logistics, maintaining the infrastructure that made it all possible. This required sophisticated administration. The priests couldn't handle it all themselves. They needed staff, lots of staff, record keepers to track donations and loans, property managers to oversee agricultural holdings, construction supervisors to maintain buildings, security personnel to guard treasuries, ritual specialists to ensure sacrifices were performed correctly, interpreters to help foreign visitors communicate, vendors to sell sacrificial animals and ceremonial supplies. The employment generated by major sanctuaries was substantial, making them major economic players in their regions. Towns that hosted important sanctuaries prospered. They had steady streams of pilgrims and tourists, guaranteed markets for their goods and services, prestigious institutions that attracted wealth and attention. But this economic success created its own problems, particularly questions of corruption and accountability. Who was watching the watchers? Who ensured that priests were managing temple wealth responsibly, that they weren't embezzling funds or making self-serving decisions? Different sanctuaries handled this differently. Some had boards of overseers, civic officials who audited temple accounts and investigated complaints. Some had elaborate internal hierarchies with checks and balances. Some relied primarily on reputation and social pressure, assuming that priests wouldn't risk their standing by engaging in obvious corruption. None of these systems were perfect. We have records of temple scandals, priests accused of theft or mismanagement, sacred funds mysteriously disappearing. The case we mentioned earlier, of the Pythia being bribed to give a favorable oracle wasn't unique. There are other recorded instances of corruption at various sanctuaries. What's interesting is that these scandals shocked people. They were news, worthy of being recorded by historians, precisely because they violated expectations. The default assumption was that temples were trustworthy, that priests were honest stewards of sacred wealth, that divine supervision somehow ensured proper behavior. When this assumption proved false, when human weakness and greed intruded into the sacred sphere, it was disturbing, threatening to the entire religious system. Let's talk about specific examples of temple wealth to make this concrete. The Parthenon in Athens, perhaps the most famous Greek temple, contained in its inner chamber a massive statue of Athena, designed by the sculptor Phidias. The statue was chryselephantine, made of gold and ivory over a wooden core. The gold alone, according to ancient sources, weighed 40 talents, roughly 1,000 kilograms, worth an almost incomprehensible amount of money in ancient terms. This single statue contained more wealth than most cities could muster. It sat in the temple, glittering in the dim light that filtered through the doorway, a spectacular demonstration of Athenian piety and prosperity. But it was also, functionally, a strategic reserve. The gold could be removed and melted down in a dire emergency. It was designed to be removable, attached to the wooden core in ways that allowed disassembly. Athens did, in fact, borrow against this gold during the Peloponnesian War, using it to fund military operations. The gold was later restored, but the incident reveals how the line between religious symbol and economic asset could blur under pressure. The sanctuary at Delphi accumulated so much wealth over the centuries that it became a target for ambitious rulers. In 356 BCE, Phocian leaders seized Delphi and used its treasury to fund a 10-year war, the Third Sacred War. They melted down dedications, minted coins, paid mercenary armies. The sacrilege was enormous, but the wealth was real and militarily useful. The war ended with Phocis defeated and the sanctuary's wealth theoretically restored. But the incident demonstrated something important. Temple wealth was vulnerable. It couldn't be protected solely by religious sanction. It required political and military backing. Powerful states took on the role of protectors of major sanctuaries, but this protection came with influence. Athens protected Delos. Sparta had influence at Olympia. Macedon, after Philip II, became the dominant power at Delphi. Protecting a sanctuary gave you political leverage, the ability to influence religious decisions, to ensure oracles were favorable to your interests. The religious and political spheres were deeply intertwined, each supporting and constraining the other. The wealthy individuals who made large donations to temples were motivated by multiple factors. Genuine piety, certainly. Many donors probably did believe they were honoring the gods, expressing gratitude, securing divine favor. But they were also engaging in conspicuous consumption, in public display of wealth and status. A large donation to a prestigious sanctuary bought you recognition. Your name would be inscribed on the dedication, visible to all visitors, preserved for posterity. If you were ambitious politically, temple donations could help your reputation, marking you as pious and generous, qualities valued in public life. If you were a merchant or manufacturer, your dedication might serve as advertising, associating your name with quality and success. Wealthy foreigners made dedications to gain acceptance in Greek society, to demonstrate their Philhellenism, their love of Greek culture. Freed slaves made dedications to mark their new status, to assert their dignity and worth. Every dedication told a story, not just about religious devotion, but about social identity, about who you were and who you wanted others to think you were. Cities made even larger dedications, and for them, the calculations were explicitly political. After a military victory, the spoils might be dedicated at Delphi or Olympia, both as thanks to the gods and as advertisement of the city's power. After the Battle of Marathon, Athens dedicated a treasury at Delphi, specifically to commemorate the victory over Persia. The treasury was positioned prominently along the sacred way, impossible to miss, covered in inscriptions and sculptural decorations celebrating Athenian heroism. This was propaganda as much as piety, a way of shaping how the Greek world understood and remembered the Persian wars. Other cities did the same, competing for prestigious space in the major sanctuaries, using religious dedications as tools of soft power. Delphi and Olympia became something like international forums, spaces where Greek cities displayed their achievements and claims to prominence, where alliances were advertised and rivalries played out in architectural form. The priests who managed these institutions occupied interesting social positions. They were often drawn from elite families, but they weren't necessarily the most politically powerful individuals in their cities. The priesthood was a prestigious role, but it was also a specialized one, requiring particular skills and knowledge. Some priestly positions were hereditary, passed down through specific families across generations. Others were filled by election or by lot, ensuring some democratic accountability. The terms varied widely. Some priests served for life. Others served for fixed terms, a year or 4 years. Some major sanctuaries had multiple priests, a chief priest supported by subordinates, each with specific responsibilities. The chief priest at Delphi, for instance, was called the prophet, and he was responsible for the overall operation of the sanctuary, but he was assisted by other officials who managed finances, organized festivals, oversaw construction, and handled day-to-day administration. These individuals needed to be competent administrators as much as religious specialists. They had to understand accounting, manage personnel, negotiate with civic authorities, handle disputes, maintain relationships with other sanctuaries. It was, in many ways, more like running a corporation than what we moderns typically associate with religious service. The relationship between priests and civic authorities could be complicated. In theory, religious matters were separate from political matters, the sacred separate from the secular. In practice, the separation was always incomplete. Major religious festivals involved civic participation. Priestly appointments were often subject to civic approval. Temple finances might be audited by city officials. Oracles might be consulted about political decisions, creating situations where priestly interpretation of divine will directly influenced policy. Neither side held absolute authority. It was a negotiated relationship, constantly being worked out through practice, sometimes harmonious, sometimes tense, occasionally breaking down into outright conflict. We have examples of cities prosecuting priests for corruption. We have examples of sanctuaries asserting their independence from civic control. We have examples of compromise, of priests and politicians finding ways to accommodate each other's interests while maintaining the fiction that religion and politics occupied separate spheres. Foreign patrons added another layer of complexity. As Greek culture spread through Alexander's conquest and the subsequent Hellenistic period, non-Greeks began participating in Greek religious institutions, making donations, consulting, oracles, participating in festivals. This brought new wealth into the sanctuaries but also raised questions. Could barbarians, non-Greeks, really honor the Greek gods appropriately? Could they be trusted with influence at pan-Hellenic sanctuaries? The answers evolved over time. Initially, there was resistance, a sense that Greek religion was for Greeks. But money talks, and the magnificent donations from Hellenistic kings were hard to refuse. A gold statue from an Egyptian king, a lavish dedication from a Syrian monarch, these became acceptable, then normal, then expected. The definition of who could be a proper participant in Greek religious life expanded to accommodate political and economic realities. By the Roman period, when Rome dominated the Mediterranean, Roman emperors were making massive donations to Greek sanctuaries, and nobody questioned their right to do so. The sanctuaries had become cosmopolitan, serving a Mediterranean-wide elite rather than specifically Greek communities. This cosmopolitanism brought its own tensions. Local Greeks might resent the influence of foreign donors. They might feel that their ancestral sanctuaries were being corrupted, turned into showcases for foreign wealth rather than serving their original religious functions. But they also benefited from the prosperity that foreign donations brought. The jobs, the economic activity, the prestige of hosting an internationally significant sanctuary, all of this accrued to the local population. It was a complicated relationship, producing both benefits and resentments, both pride and anxiety. The priests had to navigate these tensions, maintaining good relationships with foreign patrons while also preserving local support, honoring traditional practices while adapting to changing circumstances. It required diplomatic skill, flexibility, political awareness. The best temple administrators were successful, partly because they could balance these competing demands, keeping everyone sufficiently satisfied to maintain the flow of donations and pilgrims. Slavery was another aspect of temple economics that deserves attention. Temples owned slaves, often substantial numbers of them. These slaves performed various functions, some menial, some specialized. They worked on temple farms, cleaned sacred spaces, served as attendants during rituals, maintained buildings and infrastructure. Some temple slaves had specific skills, working as accountants or scribes or craftsmen. The conditions of temple slavery probably varied widely. Some temple slaves might have had relatively tolerable conditions, assured food and shelter, work that wasn't physically brutal, perhaps even a degree of respect due to their association with sacred institutions. Others probably endured conditions not much different from any other form of ancient slavery, which is to say, quite harsh. Temples also participated in the practice of sacred manumission, where slaves could purchase their freedom by dedicating money to the temple. The slave paid a sum to the temple and was then declared free, theoretically becoming a servant of the god rather than of a human master, though in practice this meant genuine freedom. This practice served multiple functions. It gave slaves hope, an attainable goal to work toward. It brought money into temple treasuries. It demonstrated the temple's benevolence and the god's power to liberate. It was economically rational for the temple, as the purchase price for freedom was typically higher than the slave's remaining market value, especially if the slave was older or in poor health. But it also created a moral accounting that must have been uncomfortable when examined too closely. The God who liberated was also the God who owned slaves in the first place. The institution that offered freedom was also participating in the system of slavery. The Greeks generally didn't find this contradictory. They saw slavery as a natural feature of society, not something requiring moral justification. But for modern readers, it's a reminder that Greek religious institutions, for all their cultural sophistication and spiritual aspirations, were embedded in social systems that accepted and perpetuated forms of oppression we now recognize as fundamentally wrong. The role of women in temple economics is complex and often obscure. We know women made dedications, sometimes substantial ones. Wealthy women had resources they could deploy, particularly widows who had inherited property. Women served in certain priestly roles, most famously as the Pythia at Delphi, but also as priestesses at other sanctuaries, particularly those associated with female deities. But women were generally excluded from the administrative and financial management of temples. They couldn't serve on oversight boards. They couldn't control how temple wealth was invested or lent. Their participation in temple economics was real, but circumscribed, reflecting broader patterns of gender inequality in Greek society. The exceptions are interesting precisely because they were exceptions. A wealthy woman who made a large donation gained recognition and, perhaps, informal influence, but she couldn't translate that into formal power within the institution. The system was designed to channel women's economic participation while limiting their authority, allowing temples to benefit from women's wealth while maintaining male control over decision-making. As the Greek world evolved through the Hellenistic and Roman periods, temple economics changed in significant ways. The rise of large territorial kingdoms, and then the Roman Empire centralized power, reducing the autonomy of individual cities and the sanctuaries they hosted. Hellenistic kings and Roman emperors made massive donations to temples, but they also expected deference in return. They appointed priests loyal to them. They consulted oracles, but made clear they expected favorable responses. They used temples as tools of their rule, ways to demonstrate piety and munificence, while also extending control. Some emperors, particularly Augustus, undertook major restoration projects at ancient sanctuaries, rebuilding temples, refurbishing facilities, endowing new festivals. These projects brought economic benefits but also served imperial propaganda, associating the emperor with the glory of classical Greece while making clear who was now in charge. By the later Roman period, many temples were shadows of their former selves economically. The old patterns of donations and pilgrimages had declined. The wealth that had accumulated over centuries was dispersed, sometimes looted, sometimes redirected to other purposes. Christianity's rise accelerated this process. Christian authorities saw pagan temples not as venerable institutions, but as rival religious centers to be suppressed. Temple properties were confiscated. Endowments were seized. Buildings were converted to Christian use or left to decay. The economic engines that had sustained Greek religion for 1,000 years ground to a halt. What remains now are ruins and inscriptions, archaeological evidence of the vast economic activity that once animated these places. Walking through Delphi or Olympia or Epidaurus today, you see marble columns and foundation stones, traces of the treasuries and temples that once stood. With effort and imagination, you can reconstruct something of what these places once were, the crowds and activity, the wealth and power. But you're seeing ghosts, remnants of institutions that thrived for centuries and then ceased to exist, their functions made obsolete, their beliefs superseded. The economics of Greek religion, the complex interweaving of piety and profit, devotion and self-interest, religious duty and financial calculation, all of this has passed away. What we can do now is study the traces, try to understand how these institutions worked, what made them function, what needs they served. And in doing so, we gain insight not just into ancient Greek religion, but into the nature of religious institutions more broadly, how they operate, how they sustain themselves, how they navigate the inevitable tension between spiritual ideals and material necessities. Every religious institution faces these tensions. The Greek temples solved them in particular ways shaped by their culture and circumstances. Their solutions were imperfect, sometimes corrupt, often self-serving. But they were also remarkably effective for a very long time, creating institutions that lasted centuries, that commanded loyalty and devotion, that produced genuine spiritual experiences even while operating according to very worldly economic principles. That combination, that ability to be simultaneously spiritual and economic, transcendent and pragmatic, might be the most enduring mystery of Greek religion, more puzzling in its way than any oracle's prophecy. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the temples and sanctuaries of ancient Greece. 2 hours, more or less, wandering through the daily exhaustion of temple servants, the ritualized trances of the Pythia, the enduring mysteries of oracular practice, and the complicated economics that sustained it all. If you're still awake, still listening, that's perfectly fine. If you've drifted off somewhere along the way, lost in the repetitive rhythms of sacrifice and prophecy, that's fine too. That's what we're here for. Let's take a moment to look back at where we've been, to gather the threads of what we've explored, though we'll do it gently, without demanding too much attention, letting the ideas settle like dust after a long day's sweeping in a temple courtyard. We began with you, hypothetically transported back 2,500 years, standing in the pre-dawn darkness, about to begin your first day as a temple servant. We walked through that day together, hour by exhausting hour. The freezing purification in sacred water, the endless sweeping of vast precincts, the inspection and washing of sacrificial animals, the throat-cutting, the blood-catching, the careful butchery that divided divine portions from human portions, the smell of burning fat and bone, the clouds of flies, the constant hauling of water in heavy amphoras, back and forth, spring to temple, temple to spring until your shoulders ached and your feet were raw, the afternoon maintenance work, the evening rituals, the collapse into bed, too tired to think, knowing you'd wake before dawn and do it all again. We explored why you, specifically, wouldn't last in this role. Not because you're weak or faithless, but because you're modern. You carry expectations about work and meaning, about comfort and choice, that would be incomprehensible to an ancient Greek. You expect work to be personally fulfilling, or at least not physically destructive. You expect to have options, alternative paths. The ancient temple servants had no such expectations. They understood that some work was simply necessary, part of maintaining the cosmic order, the relationship between mortals and gods. They did it day after day with a kind of endurance that we can barely imagine, because that's what their world required. Then we shifted our focus upward in the temple hierarchy, to the Pythia at Delphi, the most famous oracle in the ancient world. We traced her daily life, the selection process that brought older women into this role, the morning purifications in freezing mountain springs, the ritual preparations before consultation days. We sat with her on the tripod in the dim Adyton, breathing vapors that modern geology suggests were real, ethylene and other gases released by geological faults beneath the temple. We experienced, as much as we could through imagination and scholarship, the altered state she entered, that controlled trance that allowed her to speak words that would be interpreted as divine prophecy. We saw her life between prophecies, the restrictions and duties, the isolation from normal life, the psychological weight of being Apollo's voice. We understood that being the Pythia was work too, different from hauling water, but equally demanding, requiring its own forms of endurance and discipline. It was a life of routine punctuated by moments of altered consciousness, of spiritual intensity, embedded in mundane maintenance and preparation. It was extraordinary and ordinary at the same time, miraculous and practical, divine and human. From there, we descended into mysteries that even scholarship can't fully resolve. Did the oracles work? How did they work? We examined multiple interpretations, multiple levels of explanation. The vapors were real, facilitating genuine altered states. The ambiguity was strategic, protecting the institution from falsification. The priests had access to information, turning the sanctuary into an intelligence clearinghouse. The consultant's belief created self-fulfilling prophecies. All of these explanations contain some truth. None of them fully captures what was happening. We looked at other forms of Greek divination, the rustling leaves at Dodona, the flight patterns of birds, the healing dreams at Asclepian sanctuaries, the drawing of lots. We saw how each method reflected different assumptions about divine communication, different ways of navigating the unbearable uncertainty of human existence. We acknowledge the skeptics, the ancient voices that questioned whether any of this really worked, and we noted that their skepticism didn't destroy the institutions, which continued functioning for centuries, suggesting that the oracles served purposes beyond accurate prediction, purposes rooted in psychology and social structure as much as in theology. Finally, we followed the money. We examined temple economics, the vast accumulations of wealth disguised as piety, the dedications and donations that turned sanctuaries into repositories of gold and bronze and precious objects. We saw how temples functioned as banks, lending money at interest, managing agricultural estates, organizing festivals that were as much economic as religious. We met the priests, who were administrators as much as religious specialists, managing complex institutions, navigating political pressures, balancing competing interests. We saw the corruption and scandals, the human failings that intruded into sacred spaces. We saw the slavery, the gender inequalities, the uncomfortable compromises that let these institutions function. We saw how foreign patrons brought wealth, but also raised questions about Greek identity and religious purity. We traced the long decline as the Greek world was absorbed into larger empires, and finally superseded by Christianity, which viewed these ancient temples not as venerable institutions, but as pagan competitors to be suppressed and replaced. What does it all mean? What can we take away from this long exploration of Greek religious life? Perhaps this, that religion, even at its most mystical and transcendent, is always embedded in material reality, in human bodies and physical spaces and economic systems. The temple servant hauling water is as much a part of Greek religion as the Pythia speaking prophecy. The accountant tracking loans is as essential as the priest interpreting omens. The wealth accumulated in treasuries is inseparable from the spiritual experiences sought by pilgrims. You can't separate the divine from the mundane, the sacred from the economic, the mystical from the practical. They're all tangled together, supporting each other, constraining each other, creating a complex system that's simultaneously spiritual and material, transcendent and pragmatic. The Greeks understood this better than we sometimes do. They didn't pretend that religion existed in some pure spiritual realm untainted by worldly concerns. They knew that honoring the gods required resources, organization, labor. They knew that temples were businesses as well as sacred spaces. They knew that priests were human, subject to the same failings and temptations as anyone else. They knew that oracles could be ambiguous, that prophecies could fail, that divine communication was uncertain and required interpretation. But they participated anyway. They made their offerings, consulted their oracles, performed their sacrifices, organized their festivals, maintained their temples. They did all of this not because the system was perfect, but because it was what they had, the framework through which they understood their relationship with the divine, with fate, with the forces beyond human control. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all any religious system can be, an imperfect human attempt to navigate mystery, to find meaning in a cosmos that doesn't automatically provide it, to create structure in the face of chaos, to establish relationship with whatever lies beyond the merely human. The Greeks did this through temples and sacrifices, oracles and festivals, priests and rituals. We do it through other means, other institutions, other practices. But the underlying impulse is the same, the need to reach beyond ourselves, to connect with something greater, to find guidance in uncertainty, to create meaning through structured practice. As you lie there now, wherever you are, in whatever comfortable modern bed with its clean sheets and soft pillow, protected from the cold by central heating, or from the heat by air conditioning, surrounded by electric lights you can turn on with a switch, you're living in a world that would be incomprehensible to those ancient temple servants and priests and oracles. You don't wake before dawn to perform purifications in freezing water. You don't spend your days butchering sacrificial animals. You don't sit on a tripod breathing mysterious vapors. You don't manage complex agricultural estates owned by gods. But you still, in your own way, navigate uncertainty. You still make decisions without knowing how they'll turn out. You still seek guidance, whether from friends, therapists, self-help books, internet forums, or quiet internal reflection. You still participate in institutions, whether religious or secular, that help structure your life and give it meaning. You still live with the tension between what you can control and what you can't, between your individual agency and the larger forces, social and natural and perhaps cosmic, that shape your existence. The Greeks solved these perennial human problems in their own way. Their solutions lasted for over 1,000 years, serving millions of people, creating some of the most enduring cultural artifacts in human history. Then their solutions stopped working, were replaced by other solutions, other frameworks, other institutions. And someday, probably, our solutions will stop working too, will be replaced by frameworks we can't yet imagine, just as the Greeks couldn't imagine the world that would succeed theirs. But tonight, in this moment, we can look back at what they created, at the temple servants and the Pythia and the priests and the whole complex machinery of Greek religion, and we can appreciate it for what it was. A remarkable human achievement, flawed and brilliant, mundane and transcendent. An answer to the question of how to live with mystery, how to organize society around the sacred, how to maintain hope and meaning in an uncertain world. And maybe, just maybe, as you've listened to these stories of ancient routines and forgotten rituals, of prophecies and sacrifices and the endless daily labor of serving invisible gods, maybe your own mind has wandered, has drifted, has found its way toward sleep, because that's what we've been doing here, really. using the past as a pathway to rest, using the distant and the detailed and the gently repetitive to quiet the urgent present, to still the anxious, forward-looking mind, to create a space where sleep can arrive naturally, without force, like dawn gradually brightening the sky over a Greek temple, inevitable and gentle. The ancient Greeks are gone. Their temples stand in ruins, their oracles silent, their sacrifices long ceased. But for a few hours tonight, we've brought them back, not as they imagined themselves, not as heroes or philosophers or warriors, but as working people, going about their daily tasks, maintaining institutions, navigating uncertainty, trying to honor their gods and feed their families and find meaning in the routine. There's something comforting in that, isn't there? In knowing that humans have always faced these challenges, always found ways to keep going, always created structures and routines and rituals that made life bearable, even meaningful. The specifics change, the frameworks evolve, but the underlying human experience, the need for structure and meaning and connection that persists across all the centuries that separate us from those ancient temple servants sweeping marble courtyards before dawn. So, rest now. You've worked hard enough today, whatever your work was. You've navigated your own uncertainties, made your own offerings to whatever gods or values or principles guide your life. You've done what you could, which is all anyone can ever do. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, its own rituals, its own mysteries. But tomorrow is tomorrow. Tonight is for rest, for letting go, for allowing your mind to drift wherever it needs to go, through ancient Greece or anywhere else, until it finds its way to sleep. The temples are quiet now. The sacrifices are finished. The oracles have spoken their last prophecies. The priests have locked the treasuries and gone to their rest. The servants have collapsed onto their reed mats, too tired to think. Even the Pythia, sitting alone in her chamber, has removed her laurel wreath and closed her eyes. Everything is still. Everything is quiet. The ancient world sleeps, and you can sleep too, knowing that the long day is done, that the rituals are complete, that the work can wait until morning. Sleep well. Dream of marble temples and sacred springs, of prophecies and mysteries of a world so distant it's like another planet, yet connected to our own by the thread of shared human experience. The endless cycle of waking and sleeping, working and resting, living and wondering, and finally, inevitably, returning to stillness. The gods, if they're watching, are smiling. Not because you've offered them anything, but because you've made it through another day, which is offering enough. Rest now. Let the ancient world fade back into the past where it belongs. Let your own world fade too, gently, gradually, until there's nothing left but darkness and quiet, and the soft approach of sleep. Good night.